Good day, students. This is Scholars Universal School online class, and this is a biology class. My name is Ms. Aditoro. So, I'll be taking you biology, and the topic is sexual reproductive system. Now, before we talk about sexual reproduction, let's talk about what reproduction is. Reproduction is one of the characteristics of living things. Every living thing has to reproduce. It is a major characteristic, major feature of living things. And when they reproduce after their own kind. Then this has to be from time to time in order to keep existing. Any living organism that cannot reproduce cannot exist. So they need to perform reproduction time to time to keep existing. And you know that every living organisms would try all their best to keep existing. Now, unicellular organisms, the simple organisms, they can undergo binary fission or asexual reproduction. But the multicellular organisms, they have systems for reproduction. So we can see how unicellular organisms reproduce here by binary fission. This is typical of amoeba. Amoeba trying to divide its nucleus and dividing its cytoplasm to form two organisms. This is simple binary fission. Okay, but the multicellular organisms, they have systems. You can see the male and the female producing gametes from their systems, from their ovary and from their texts during meiosis to form the sperm fertilize the ovum, and during fertilization you have a diploid zygote being produced. So this is a multicellular reproduction, and that is what we want to talk about in details. Now, sexual reproduction as it is has to do with fusion, coming together of gametes from two individuals of the same species. Now, it could be that one of the black, one will be white, but they have to be of the same species. So two individuals is always involved in sexual reproduction, usually a male and a female, and each of them will produce the gametes that will be fused together to produce offspring. So we see that in unicellular organisms like Chlamydomonas, we have the simplest form of reproduction. Chlamydomonas is a unicellular organism, and what happens is that the two free living cells, they come together and fuse their nuclei. And by the time they fuse their nuclei, they reproduce, they divide again to form daughter cells. But in multicellular organisms, gametes are produced. So the simple ones will do it just fusing their gametes together and eventually dividing it. But for the multicellular organisms that are well developed, they produce gametes. That is why we said that sexual reproduction has to do with fusion of gametes. So those gametes are produced from special organs, and those special organs are called gonads. So the simplest gonad is found in hydra. We know that hydra is the first organism that is regarded as multicellular. That is where we notice tissue differentiation. So it has the simplest form of gonad that produce gametes. And what happens is that the same animal produce male and the female gonad. So hydra, they are hermaphrodites. One organism produce the male gonad and the female gonad. So when those gonads are ripe, the wall of the male gonad bursts, and the male gametes are liberated inside the water. So that will now swim towards the female ripe gonad. And by the time they come together, the female will split open and expose the egg. They will release the egg and they will fuse together to form fertilization. So when food is plenty and the weather is favorable, hydra can also reproduce asexually by producing birds, which eventually will detach and form another organism. So we see that the simplest form of sexual reproduction, in which we have production of gametes from the gonad, is found in the hydra. Unlike the Chlamydomonas that we just said that they are going to fuse together. So gamete production from the gonad is first noticed in hydra. So In C or she, I want us to talk about the simple organism before we move to the complex ones. So in C or she's, we see that the female produce millions of eggs at one time, and the male will also pass out greater quantity of male gametes. So the male and the female they live in the same environment, and the gametes will swim towards each other. So there is a fair chance that the male gametes will reach the eggs. That is why they produce large quantity, so that by the time, though they are in the same environment, they just produce their gametes at wherever they are, and by the time they meet together, they fertilize and they have a developed individual. So gamete formation and fertilization. The two important events in sexual reproduction have to do with the reduction division that we call meiosis, that has to do with production of gametes, and the coming together of gametes. The coming together is also called fertilization. So meiosis is the number of chromosome sets in the nucleus is haploid. So during meiosis division, it results into production of gametes in which the number of chromosomes is haploid, is halved. So fertilization has to do with the two haploid gametes coming together to form a diploid zygote. So the organism that developed from that zygote is made up of diploid cells. So we said that haploid cells or gametes will come together and fuse together to form a diploid gamete. Okay, so sexual reproduction in vertebrates. Now, for vertebrates, they are much more developed than those simple organisms that we have talked about, the invertebrates. So, but all vertebrates undergo sexual reproduction, and the process takes place in 3 steps. One, the first step is formation of gametes by meiotic division, which I have said that it divides the chromosome number into half to form haploid cells. So that is the first thing that has to happen for sexual reproduction to occur. Formation of gametes by meiotic division, then coming together of those gametes, which we call fertilization. So the male gamete and the female gamete come together to form a zygote. Then the growth and the development of zygote to form a new or a young individual. So after fertilization, the zygote begin to grow and develop gradually to form a young individual. So those 3 things are key in sexual reproduction. So all vertebrates reproduce, they can reproduce externally or internally. What I mean is this: their reproductive mechanism, their means of fertilization can be external or internal. It is usually external in the primitive organisms, like we have talked about the sea urchin, like the hydra. It is usually external. The male will release the sperm, and the sperm will find a chance of looking for the egg to fuse together for fertilization to occur. But in the advanced form, you have internal fertilization, in which the male and the female have to copulate together to perform fertilization. So internal fertilization calls for copulation of male and female animal, which results in the formation of zygote within the female body. Sometimes the zygote is formed within the female body. Sometimes the fertilized egg will be released before the egg will now break open to release the zygote. Okay, so let's start from fishes and amphibians. We know that in biology, we have the vertebrates, those animals that have backbone, starting from the fishes to amphibians to reptiles to apes and to mammals. So let's start. We are going to talk about each of them one after the other, but we can compare these two together, fishes and amphibians. We know that these two animals live in aquatic environments. They live in a water environment, and during mating, what happens is that the male and the female animal, they come close to each other. Sometimes you can notice a little bit of courting relationship between the male and female. They call themselves to come together. So when they come together, They come close to each other, and the female will discharge egg. The same as the female is discharging egg, the male will also spread the sperm on it. So fertilization is usually external. The actively swimming sperm move towards the fertilized eggs and move towards the eggs and fertilize the egg. So when the eggs are fertilized, it will hatch into larvae, which feed actively and later become young adults. So we see that fertilization is external. The egg, the female, even though they come close together, unlike the she or she that they just release their gametes at different places, these ones come close to each other. So as the female is releasing their eggs, the male is also spreading the sperm on it. So fertilization is external, the sperm will fertilize the egg, and by the time the egg is fertilized, it will hatch into larvae, which will eventually grow into young adult. That's what we have in both fishes and amphibians. This is frog, sexual reproduction in frog. This is how it happens. So you can see them mounting on the other. The female carries the male. So you can see that the female is usually larger and stronger. So without even checking their genital organs, you can see, you will notice that the female are usually bigger and stronger because they carry the male. So as they are releasing their eggs, the sperm is spread on it. So they always do that in a water environment, even though adult toad do not live inside the water. But when it comes to reproduction, they come to the water environment. And when they release their eggs, these are the eggs that are released. The eggs will hatch on its own into larvae that is called tadpole. And they'll begin to develop gradually into an adult toad or frog. So this is what happens in fishes too. The female fishes will lay their eggs, then the male fish will spread sperm over it, and eventually the fertilized egg will hatch and release small fingerlings that will now grow into big fishes. So this is what we see in fishes and amphibians. In reptiles and birds now, they are more advanced, so they live on land, and their gametes are released into aquatic environments. Aquatic environment is necessary for sexual reproduction. So even though they live on dry land, their gametes has to be released in aquatic surroundings. So their fertilization is internal. Internal, we still have water environment, aquatic environment in the internal organs. So the fertilization of birds and reptiles is internal. That means that the male and the female gametes will come together within the body of the female. So what that calls for is a special copulatory organ. For the male and the female, for the male to introduce anything into the female, the copulatory organ is necessary. So we can see the lizard, which is this is an example of a reptile having a copulatory organ that will be introduced into the female to release the sperm into a watery part of the female body where the eggs are. Then by the time the sperms are released into the female's body, there will be fertilization, and they can now lay their eggs on land. So it's not as if they will give birth to a fertilized baby, but they lay a fertilized egg on land. So each egg contains an embryo embedded in a fluid-filled sac within which it can develop just like an aquatic environment. Okay, so we see the reptiles copulating. These are reptiles, you see them copulating. These are birds, they copulate to produce a fertilized egg. So they lay fertilized egg, and the egg is now hatched to release an individual. So we have the egg in reptiles and birds. Let's examine the egg in reptiles. Before I move on, let me tell you now that birds do not have copulatory organ. By the time we check their system, we will see that. We are still going to examine the system of each of these vertebrates. So The egg of reptiles and birds has a shell, and it has um, a calcicarous covering which protect the inner structure. So it has something like a bony structure, not really bony, but you can see that the shell is a little hard to protect whatever that is inside. And the shell also allow gaseous exchange, so it is porous. Then the shell membrane provides a moist surface for gaseous diffusion. They need gases, oxygen to diffuse in, and carbon dioxide to diffuse out. So the shell membrane has to be porous enough to allow diffusion of gases. Then the egg cell membrane is also called the embryonic membrane. It's made up of four main things. You have the yolk sac, the amnion, the chorion, and the allantois. We are going to check them one after the other. Now, the yolk sac contains yolk. You can see the yolk of the egg. This is the internal structure of the egg. If you look at it outside, this is the shell. Some egg can be white. In reptiles, you see that most of their eggs, they are usually white, buried in the sand. They don't incubate. But the birds, they incubate their eggs. So, and their outer covering can be brownish like this in color. So the embryonic sac contains the yolk, and the major function of the yolk is that it provides food, usually fat and proteins for the embryo. So it is very rich in food content that the embryo needs to grow. So the amnion secretes amniotic fluid that provides aquatic environment. You know, we said that aquatic environment is necessary for sexual reproduction. And since these animals, they are no longer on land, they still have to perform their reproduction in an aquatic environment. That is the need for the internal fertilization. So the fluid also acts as shock absorber that contribute to the protection of the embryo. So it's the fluid, the amniotic fluid is the one that surrounds it. It acts like shock absorber to protect the growing embryo. The chorion controls the permeability of gases and fluid You know, we said that they need gases to diffuse in and out. So the chorion is the one that controls the permeability of gases. Then the allantois, they act as excretory stores for the embryo. Their major function is to release, they store nitrogenous waste and act as gaseous diffusion surfaces to enable oxygen to diffuse in and from the surrounding, and carbon dioxide, which is the major waste, to diffuse out. So we can see all those parts. You can see an embryo developing, feeding on the yolk. This is the air space. This is the amniotic fluid that serves as the shock absorber. This is the fluid, liquid here. The abdomen is air, and this is the egg, the shell membrane. Okay, so within the shell, the embryo grows and develops into a new organism. Most reptiles do not incubate their eggs. I've said that the other time. They do not incubate means, you know, the birds rest on the egg to keep it warm. The reptiles don't do that. Instead, they lay their eggs in surfaces and bury them in the sand so that they can protect them from predators and keep them warm. So when it is time for the young embryo is released from the egg. Now the birds lay their eggs in nests. You can see them preparing, they prepare nests, and they incubate. The adult birds incubate. This is what they are trying to do. They incubate, then they now hatch into a young ones. This is a young chick trying to hatch from the egg. Okay, so reproduction in mammals. We've talked about fishes and amphibians. We've talked about um, reptiles and birds, and now we want to talk about mammals. You can see that it is becoming more complex. Fishes and amphibians undergo external fertilization. We see that mammals, birds, and reptiles, they undergo internal fertilization, but they still release fertilized egg. So, but in mammals, we see that there are three categories of mammals anyway. We have the monotremes, they are oviparous, they lay eggs, they lay fertilized eggs. They have the marsupials, they are viviparous, which means they give birth to incompletely developed features, which will mature in the mother's pouch. Then we have the placentas. They are the viviparous. They are also viviparous. So they are retained, they retain their young ones in their uterus for a long time for development. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to say. The oocyte is inside the rats, and you can see this is the female, this is the male releasing the sperm. By the time the two of them come together, they'll be able to release their young ones. Okay, so most mammals do not lay eggs, like I've said. Only few of them lay eggs, but most mammals do not lay eggs. So that's why we regard them as viviparous, because they give birth to their young ones. So after fertilization, the fertilization is usually internal. The embryo develops quickly, and the moment the embryo develops, the placenta has to be formed. So the placental is like a connection between the mother and the baby, through which the embryo gets its nourishment, water, oxygen, and everything they need to grow. They also get rid of their waste through the placenta. So the protection of the embryo within the mammalian body ensures that full development of embryo takes place without the danger from predators. You can see that the embryo is not exposed to predator. The eggs are not released. Everything is inside the female body. So we notice parental care in mammals. Even though parental care is first noticed in birds, you can see that they incubate their eggs, and they even go along with their chicks for some times, but it is not for a permanent time. But we notice more of parental care in mammals, and it may last for several years. So we are going to stop here. The part two of this sexual reproduction, we talk about the systems of reproduction. We examine this system, how this system is able to um, perform the reproduction in the way we have explained it in this presentation. So I want you to check your textbook, comprehensive certificate, answer questions under this topic. Thank you.